It's California Edition. My name is Brad Pomerance, and we are coming to you from Sacramento, the state's capital. We are joined by Tom Torlakson. He is the Superintendent for Public Instruction, and so there's no doubt we are seeing a revolution in public education in California, a lot of exciting changes. This year, we're seeing a very significant change in what we know as standardized tests, which I know you're not a huge fan of, but be that as it may, talk to us about what's known as the Smarter Balanced Assessment Tests.
Well, instead of the old bubble tests, which were based on a learning model of lots of memorization, cover a lot of material, get a lot of facts, and do multiple choice testing, this is more computer adaptive, 21st century skills. The test through the computer, everybody will take a computer test. 3.2 million students are taking the test as we speak. We're seeing what their skills are in problem solving, critical thinking, good communication skills, good writing skills, how they bring evidence to bear in any subject to their argument, to their hypothesis.
You mentioned computer adaptive, and I think that may be the most interesting. As I understand it, and correct me if I'm wrong, if student A gets the first question correct, they'll move on to one question. If student B gets the first question incorrect, they'll move on to a different question. Is that what computer adaptive means?
Yes, and we can see through that, we can see students who are advanced, we can see how far advanced they are, so their lesson plans can be tailored ultimately to an advanced level of mathematics, for instance. Or if it's a third grade test, but the students are getting the answers wrong for third grade level of skills, they may be at second grade, they may be at first grade, but the computer will help determine that and give an individual way for teachers to read out how their students are doing.
And now, as I understand it, with this test, we will not have reportable results. Is that accurate?
That is correct. This is a field test, testing the questions themselves and testing the technology. Do we have the bandwidth? Are the servers all going to work? Do we have the electrical capacity?
Do we?
We're hoping. We're hoping. And one of the things we want to do, Brad, is determine through this process where the glitches are. There may be bumps in the road. There may be obstacles. How do we address them and make sure the questions work and are understandable and fair, and make sure the technology works?
And what about technology? Because as I understand, the test will be administered through iPads. And I'm sure you've heard certain school districts have had challenges with the distribution of iPads, LAUSD as an example. So where do we stand on that front?
We stand on getting more technology in the schools, and then students who don't have a one-to-one, each student has a computer, they'll have computer labs. And they may be desktops, they may be laptops, they may be iPads, they may be Chromebooks, so there's a lot of ways, and you make sure then that you have the equipment. You need an earphone, you need a keyboard to go with whatever type of internet connecting device you use.
And with these tests, will they still be multiple choice but adaptive? How will it work?
There'll be some of that, again, and it will be adaptive, so that is part of it, and there'll be writing samples, there'll be performance tasks that may involve a lesson in the classroom, then some reading in the classroom, and then there'll be questions on a computer that students will take to sort of blend together real life situations relevant to the real world, sort of not math by itself in a silo or science by itself, but how it all integrates in the real world.
And as I understand it, though, there is one challenge, and that deals with the federal government. As I understand, the federal government requires certain standardized testing, even though we may be moving away from that with Common Core, but at this stage, they require certain standardized testing, and we're not providing that because we're not reporting. So is California at risk of losing federal funds because we're not reporting our scores from this year's standardized test?
The short answer is no. We decided in California, the governor, myself, the State Board of Education, let's not spend any time on the old standards and the old curriculum. Let's drive forward. You can't drive forward looking in the rearview mirror. So we decided to test all across 3.2 million students, and to do it in both subject matters, we just got a waiver from the federal government to allow us to go forward. So this is good news.
When we come back, I want to continue our conversation, talk about Common Core. For our viewers on HLN, we thank you for joining us. For our other viewers, we'll be right back. So Superintendent, I want to ask you about the Common Core standards. Very interesting. 45 states have adopted it, and the other 5 may adopt some portion of it. But it continues to be controversial in some quarters. What's your sense of California's adoption of Common Core and the controversies that are arising as a result?
We have a large consensus in support of the Common Core. I travel up and down the state. I talk to business leaders, college leaders. They want the set of skills we're testing for. They think we should have a more rigorous set of standards. Some are dismissing this. This is Fed Ed. This is top down. This grew from a concern by state school chiefs like myself and governors saying we were falling behind the rest of the world in our skill set, in what our students were graduating able to do and what they had in terms of knowledge and capacity. So this is a real positive shift. Again, 21st century skills, critical thinking, problem solving, and working in teams and communicating well.
One of the attributes, or alleged attributes, of Common Core is the notion that students will be educated on fewer subjects but dig deeper, as opposed to digging less deep on more subjects. I could make an argument for either paradigm. Why do you believe that deeper and fewer is better than less deep and more?
Well, a mile wide and an inch thick.
Well stated.
You go back to Cro-Magnon, you go to the Greeks and Romans, and maybe you get to World War I, maybe you get to World War II, but instead narrow it and then allow teachers to be creative in the lesson plans they create, going deeper and getting students to really think about moments in history and what caused different events to happen and the individuals who were behind it. So I'm sensing teachers are welcoming the chance to be creative, and students are welcoming the chance to think and to work together in groups to solve problems.
And what's so interesting is, just as Common Core is launching nationally, we in California have a new model for funding education which provides greater discretion. It's called the local control funding formula. And
yes, it's so good.
And so give us a sense, to the extent that you are aware, how is local control funding formula rolling out? I'm sure you know that school districts are required, in the best sense, to engage in what's called LCAPs, which are these meetings with stakeholders and stuff. Have you heard any reports from the field on what parents and stakeholders are saying about their desires with regard to LCFF and then by definition Common Core?
There's a lot more work needing to be done to engage parents, but we must do that. And where they're engaging, and it's widespread across the state, we're finding their input is important, and their shared ideas in terms of the decision-making process is so important. The extra money, and it's billions of dollars, are targeted into districts where there are English learners, where there are low-income students who are behind. And if we can't catch them up, it's bad for our economy. We're getting their parents involved. And so we need, the PTA is helping with this. A number of organizations are putting on workshops and training sessions for parents.
Have you heard any reports of what the parents are saying? Because there are different ways to approach additional funding. I could see some parent groups saying, please have more summer school, or have summer school at all. You know, that gap is killing my kids in terms of the drop-off. I could see some saying, use some of the money for after-school programs, or get more computer labs. Are you hearing reports from the field?
It's mixed, mostly positive, that this is democracy, this is local control, this is citizens involved in the destiny of their children and their community and their schools. So that's really positive. There's a few cases where we're hearing, well, it was a token invitation. It wasn't a genuine, you arrived and they told you what they wanted to do instead of asking you what you wanted to do and understanding the choices. So we really need this parent engagement. We're working on expanding the communications with parents, because we want every parent to be involved. We know when parents are involved in their kids' education, their kids excel much better.
Is there a contradiction between Common Core standards and LCFF discretion? Because on the one hand, we're trying to nationalize base level standards. On the other hand, we're giving some more discretion through LCFF.
That's an interesting observation, but I think it's important to have a common target that we can aim at as California, as states, as a nation, so we will be globally competitive. And if we were in a mobile society, students and their families move from state to state, and instead of having a mixed set of targets, they can keep step with progress. The local control is about how do you spend your tax dollars locally, how do you interact with your elected school board members, and make sure that they spend the money wisely in a way that you think is productive to advancing students, all students.
So there's still a baseline that all districts in California will still need to meet, based upon California standards as well as Common Core standards.
Absolutely. And that's what's common about it. It's not common like it's dull or...
it's an exciting time.
It's an exciting time.
Very
Lots
exciting.
of enthusiasm.
His name is Tom Torlakson. He is the Superintendent for Public Instruction in the great state of California. I'm Brad Pomerance. This is California Edition. It's California Edition. My name is Brad Pomerance, and we are coming to you from Sacramento, California, the state's capital. We are joined by Craig Watson. He is the director of the California Arts Council, which is what?
It's a state agency. It's been in existence since 1976. Every state has one, and in our case, like the other states, our role is to help promote creativity, the arts, throughout the state for all citizens. But that's what we do.
And you have been working with a variety of stakeholders, a variety of counterparts, including Superintendent Tom Torlakson. And I want to hear about a program that you've been working with him. It's called Create California. Tell us about Create California.
So CREATE, as an acronym,
Yes.
it stands for Core Reforms Engaging Arts to Educate. And shortly after Tom became the state superintendent, he met with us and said, what can we do to help promote bringing the arts back in a more robust way in the schools? And so this initiative, it's really a collaborative between the State Department of Education, the California Arts Council, the California Alliance for Arts Education, and then the county superintendents. Those four are the main organizational members, and then there's over 600 people in a large statewide coalition really working on a number of initiatives. And right now we're about in the midst of finishing a blueprint for creative schools, which will have several recommendations for policy, legislative, local control, funding, that sort of thing.
And let's talk about it, because you are now faced with a unique challenge. We are seeing really a revolution in education, both in California and nationwide.
Correct.
On the one hand, we have Common Core standards coming in, which is a national program, setting minimum standards, one could argue. But on the other hand, in California, we have what's called the local control funding formula, which gives more discretion to local districts.
Right.
We don't see those categoricals where the state says, okay, spend this amount of money on arts, this amount of money on science. So how are you working to merge these competing interests?
Well, it's essential that we're at the table in both cases. In fact, one of the things we did this year with special funding we got uniquely this year from Speaker Perez is one of our investments was in something we call Creativity at the Core. And that's a project between the county superintendents and local arts agencies in 11 regions working to develop teacher training, professional development, where the arts and Common Core subjects can be integrated from a curriculum standpoint. And then on the local control funding formula, one of our partners, the California Alliance for Arts Education, has a toolkit now that's been developed to really help explain to parents and administrators and principals and teachers that the arts is a absolutely proven strategy in helping to meet the goals and objectives of what we need for our kids at the local level.
Enlighten us more on that point.
Well, think about it. We know that the arts, many of us who grew up in California and remember a rich experience of the arts, and unfortunately, that's not so much the case anymore. We still have pockets where the arts are rich in school, but in some of our schools where the needs are the greatest, we see the least amount of the arts, and yet we know that it's a proven strategy for improving test scores, keeping kids in school, they're more likely to graduate, they're more engaged in their education. So if you want to talk about local control and what would it do to help reform a school, the arts ought to be at one of the things at the center.
And what's nice about the state of California is that the state, through its tax form, allows Californians to voluntarily donate to the arts through a program known as Keep Arts in School. Tell us about that program. We're in tax season now.
That's right. And so the legislature this last year put through a bill that allowed us to return to the state tax form. That was carried by Senator Carol Liu.
Yes.
And now if you're going through your tax form as a state taxpayer, you can find a few things, various things to contribute to voluntarily. In our case, we want everybody to look for that Keep Arts in Schools category and make a contribution, because 100% of those funds will go into programs that serve arts in the school.
At the same time, California has seen a downturn in the economy, in the state budget, and what we know is that over the last several years and decades, funding from the state directly has dropped to levels that are, one could argue, quite surprising. Yeah. Talk to us about that, and then we can talk about maybe some fixes on that point.
Well, that's right. So at the agency's height, the budget was close to $32 million. And that may sound like a lot, but on a state as large as California, only put us sort of in the middle of the pack relative to our counterparts in other states. But at this moment, We are slightly out of dead last because of the special money we got this last June from Speaker Perez. But at $7 million, we're 47th out of 50 states on a per capita investment.
And this is California, which really is driven in many communities by arts.
Well, in fact, Senator Lieu hosted a hearing recently of the Joint Committee on the Arts where we spoke about the impact of the creative economy in California. $273 billion in gross state product, nearly 10% of the state's output comes from the creative industries, and that's certainly Hollywood entertainment, it's theater, it's furniture design, automotive design, graphic design, gaming design, any industry that has as its creative component. So we, at our peril, ignore the notion of how do we grow the workforce of the 21st century.
It's interesting you list those categories because when folks think about the arts, it's easy to really become really focused on traditional definitions of the arts, painting, but it's so much more than that.
Well, that's right. And again, this research that was done through the LA County Economic Development Corporation in partnership with Otis College of Art and Design shows that artists are employed across so many sectors, and it's 8% of our workforce. So it's a piece of our California economy that is critical to our future, it's critical to our competitive standing in the world. And so again, investment in things like arts in schools is how we're going to inspire the generation of workforce in the future.
I understand that two members of the legislature, one in the Senate, Senator Ted Lieu, one in the Assembly, Assemblyman Ian Calderon, they are sponsoring bills that may increase funding to the California Arts Council.
Yes.
What's the update on those bills? What can you tell us?
Yeah, they're early in their review, and we're watching them very obviously in an interested manner.
Sure.
Assemblyman Calderon's bill was heard this week as just a first step in his committee in the Assembly, Arts and Tourism and Entertainment. Senator Lieu's bill, as I understand it, has not quite yet been scheduled for review yet, but will come up. He's the chair of the Joint Committee on the Arts. And so those we're watching closely.
At the same time, if someone is watching is an artist, there are opportunities for grants through the California Arts Council and a variety of different avenues. Why don't you tell us about those?
Yeah, typically an individual artist doesn't come in for an individual grant. What they would do is if they're working in a school, for instance, and many of our best artists start out looking for work in lots of places, let's face it. And so many of our artists are very good at working with children, and so we have a program called Artists in the Schools.
Yes.
And so we will fund usually a local nonprofit who then will contract or hire the local artist. Could be a theater, could be an actor, a dancer, a poet, or a visual artist.
There's also the element of economic development. And I, a few years ago, worked on a project whereby we looked at the redevelopment agency in Los Angeles and how it revitalized Hollywood. Redevelopment agencies are now a thing of the past, but what was remarkable to me about the revitalization of Hollywood is how much art played a role in the redevelopment agency's revitalization of the community. So you're stepping in that role at some level.
Well, certainly not at the same level as those agencies, but in several important ways we're trying to. So using your example of redevelopment, the other example in Los Angeles is that downtown space called Grand Performances. Right next to the Museum of Contemporary Art. And that facility was the beneficiary of that early thinking that it's the arts that can bring together people, attract them to an area, help with economic development. But this week I'm speaking in Hanford at the annual conference of Main Streets Association.
Exciting.
And the topic is how can the arts be used for economic development? And there's lots of ways to do that. Wonderful examples.
His name is Craig Watson. He is the director of the California Arts Council here in the great state of California. My name is Brad Pomerance, and this is California Edition. This is California Edition. I'm Brad Pomerance. We're coming to you from Sacramento, California. We are joined by Steve Bradford. He is a member of the California State Assembly. He chairs the Assembly's committee called BMOC. I like that name, Boys and Men of Color. And as a result of that chairmanship, he was recently invited to the White House.
Yes.
What an honor. What a day.
A tremendous day. I was there for the president's initiative, his rollout of My Brother's Keeper, which is framed around much of the work that we've done here in California over the last 3.5 years under Boys and Men of Color, the select committee that Speaker John Perez created in 2011, which Sandra Swanson was the initial chairman of that.
And I want to speak with you about Boys and Men of Color, and I'm speaking to you about it as an individual of European descent, and I own that right here and now. When I think about men of color, I don't necessarily have a sense of how men of color interact with each other. I think there's a machismo that makes it difficult, but I don't know. Talk to me about that.
I mean, the interaction is pretty much the same, you know, regardless of race. I mean, but there is a sense of, you know, trying to prove yourself a little bit more sometimes in that environment because of society as a whole seems to always doubt your ability. So it seems like when there's opportunity to kind of like show that machismo,
Right.
we do it a little bit more probably.
But you've taught me that there are unique challenges for boys and men of color. And that's part of what you've been exploring. And that's part of what you explored in Washington. Talk to us about those challenges from the heart.
I mean, I've lived it, and I see it on a daily basis of just the school to prison pipeline, the number of young individuals who are under gang injunctions simply because of where they live, walking home, never committed a crime, and they're put on gang injunctions when their white counterparts, if they live in a gang neighborhood and they're stopped by the police, they're not subjected to that. Just the expulsion rate right now that we're looking at, Latinos and African Americans in school, just had a hearing in LA, it's through the roof.
And what's most depressing is that Latinos and African Americans are often at each other's throats.
Without a doubt.
Yeah, that there isn't that camaraderie that I guess one could hope for or dream of. It just doesn't exist.
It exists overall, but in these challenged neighborhoods and these challenged and underserved communities and schools, that's where the tension really is. I mean, when we're all being treated equal, we find a way to get along, but when you have this great divide of resources and discrimination, racism is still alive and well in America.
And we've discussed this before. The African American population is stable. The Latino population is growing. And so for better or for worse, issues that may be unique to African Americans can be shelved.
Without a doubt.
And what does that do? What do you do when you're an advocate for African Americans? I know you're an advocate for humanity, but
Exactly.
but you know what I'm getting at. When that's your community.
It creates a bigger challenge. I mean, because often we're being told, get over it. You know, those programs are no longer needed. I mean, even the big debate that we're having in the legislature now regarding SCA 5.
Which is the repeal of Prop 209.
Exactly. Only in the aspects of school admissions. And people are acting like we're admitting unqualified individuals to college.
Let's face it. I mean, I've heard plenty of people say, we have a black president. But we've arrived.
Well, and many times we're a victim of some of those successes, and they think those programs are no longer needed, but we know they still are.
When we come back, I want to hear more about the trip specifically to Washington. What did you learn? What did the president say? We're speaking with Steve Bradford. For our viewers on HLN, I want to thank you so much for joining us. For our other viewers, we'll be right back. So, sir, I want to continue our conversation and speak about the actual day, the actual event. Talk to me about the moment, the time.
It's a lot of energy. I mean, it was tremendous energy in the room. Magic Johnson,
Yes.
Karen Bass, Congresswoman Karen Bass, Barbara Lee from California. We had a swath of people all across the country.
Curran Price,
Curran
former
Price,
colleague,
exactly.
now at LA City
Sandra
Council.
Swanson, Mayor of Oakland. And the president rolled out his initiative of what My Brother's Keepers was all about. And it was about helping young African American, Latino, and Asian Pacific Islander young men and boys succeed in the educational system in the workforce readiness, in the health areas where we've seen data, empirical data that says that those challenges still exist as to accessing resources, having quality schools and equipment in those schools. And the president rolled out his plan, and it clearly mirrored a lot of what we've done in California.
Nice. And I know that his plan also stole from, if I may use that term, a plan that's been rolling out in Chicago called BAM, Becoming a Man. Tell me about BAM.
The president had opportunity to visit these young men last year and was invited, and the next thing you know, he took off his tie, rolled up his sleeves, and what was supposed to be like just a pop-in visit turned into a 30-minute rap session. And the president was sharing with these young boys the same challenges that he went through as a young man of color, where he wasn't focused on school. He even mentioned using drugs at an early age that could have been detrimental to him, and that how we easily can fall off track. And he says that if it wasn't for the support system that he had, and many of these young men do not have, he could have wound up just like them.
So what lessons did you take away? What best practices? I mean, maybe we have the best practices because of BMOC here in California, but be that as it may, I mean, what did you bring home?
What I brought home was the reality that this is a real crisis, and that's the real tragedy of this thing, because I constantly ask, why do we need a select committee on boys and men of color if it wasn't for what we've seen through the data, what we've seen every day in society? And so what it's taken away is that it's a lot of work to be done in this area. And despite all of the advances that we've made as people, as a society, there are still a segment of this community in California and this nation who are being treated as second-class citizens.
And you mentioned CA 5, which I spoke with GOP Senate Leader Bob Huff recently about this, and I think it's fair to say it was a surprise what happened in the Assembly.
Yes, it was.
It advanced through the Senate and it died in the Assembly. And a lot of it was as a result of one of the groups that is represented in BMOC, Asian Americans,
Yes.
who currently are disproportionately represented in our public institutions.
Without a doubt.
Without a doubt. And if you look at Latino numbers, rising. You look at African American numbers, not rising. Not rising.
Not at all.
And so where do we go on this fundamental debate of our time?
It's all about equality, and if we don't want to really embrace it, in the 800-pound elephant in the room is always race that nobody wants to talk about, and we need to address it.
But how do you respond to those that would say we are now a meritocracy and we don't care what color you are, you will be admitted based upon your scores?
And no one's saying you shouldn't. Scores have always been, it's not been a single individual of color who has been admitted to the Cal State or UC system that didn't have the grades. All we said, consider race as one of those factors. When you look at extracurricular activity, community volunteer work, we just say consider race as well.
How fascinating that the bill died in the Assembly.
Well, we sent it back to the Senate to try to rework some of the technicalities on it. And I understand, but it's still a work in progress. The Legislative Black Caucus and the Latino Caucus are very committed to having this legislation move forward.
The API Caucus is not.
Well,
and the API Caucus is part of the Democratic family.
Without a doubt.
And so these are challenging times.
And I'm really disappointed that some of the fear-mongering that was used, this 80/20 website, I don't know if you've had a chance to visit it, but I encourage anyone to visit this 80/20 website, and if you don't find that to be the most racist, offensive website out, then we have to have a discussion.
As you look forward, how are you feeling about BMOC, about BAM, about My Brother's Keeper?
I'm excited because now we have a national spotlight on a problem that we clearly know exists. We don't need any more hearings to determine the challenges. We know what those challenges are. Now it's about putting it all together, the pieces. To make it work.
His name is Steve Bradford. He is a member of the California State Assembly. My name is Brad Pomerance, and this is California Edition.